All right. So now we're going to hear from Mr. Gregory Poling from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's the Senior Fellow and Director of Southeast Asia, and he's going to be discussing navigating challenges and opportunities in Southeast Asia. Come on up, Greg.
Well, thank you, Mike, for the kind introduction and the kind invitation. And thank you all so much for giving me some of your time this morning. Like the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, this is somewhat personal to me as well, as I think it is to most families in the United States. My father was a veteran. He deployed in '68. I think it's hard to find a family in the United States who hasn't been touched by the war in one way or another. And too often we forget that that impact is intergenerational. It didn't end in the 90s with normalization, and it's not going to end anytime soon. So this is a considerable honor and something very special for me. I speak to a lot of groups here in Washington, but very few in which I feel a certain moral obligation and weight like I do in this one. So as Mike said, I direct the Southeast Asia program around the street here at CSIS, which is the biggest nonpartisan foreign policy think tank here in Washington. We're also the largest Southeast Asia program. I've been over there since 2011. I started as our Vietnam researcher long before they asked me to run the program. And the very first analytical report I ever worked on at CSIS was on the military medical agreement that the U.S. and Vietnam signed in 2011. The first time we'd ever signed a military agreement with Vietnam. And I think it helped set a milestone for us to conceptualize just how remarkable the progress in the bilateral relationship has been. And I'll say I'll address Laos and Cambodia a bit, but mostly I'm going to focus on the U.S.-Vietnam relationship because it's so central in U.S. policy in the region at the moment. We didn't normalize diplomatic ties with Vietnam until 1996. Zero formal diplomatic relations of any kind, zero military relations, very, very little economic interchange. By 2011, we were signing military agreements. It was only in 2016 that it became legal for the United States to trade arms with Vietnam. The arms embargo was in place until the twilight days of the Obama administration. So really, the fully normalized military relationship is 8 years old. 8. And yet, last fall, President Biden flew to Hanoi, as you heard earlier, signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with the Vietnamese government, General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong, the highest formal level of diplomatic relations that Vietnam has. Now, that sounds like a lot of jargon here in the U.S., and it somewhat is, but Vietnam still maintains a pretty rigid Leninist hierarchy for how it feels about other countries. The United States is now at the top of that list, alongside Russia and China, who joined about 15 years ago, but also alongside Japan, Australia, South Korea, India. Vietnam has been very rapidly, for the last 10 years now, trying to diversify its traditional relationships, minimize its dependence on Beijing and Moscow, and be embraced by the wider international community, and in particular the West. And the U.S. has responded to that call. Vietnam is probably the third, maybe, closest strategic partner the U.S. has in the region at the moment, trailing only behind our treaty ally, the Philippines, and Singapore, which is vital to U.S. deployments in the region. There's an enormous amount of trust, people-to-people exchange, economic exchange that goes both ways. The United States is Vietnam's largest export market. Two-way trade in the last year we had good data, which was 2022, was $125 billion from effectively $0 30 years ago. You can talk to any company here in Washington or anywhere else in the States. Vietnam is their probably number 2 focus right now after India. Every company trying to get out of China is looking to Vietnam. And that attention has helped open Vietnam ever wider. On the people-to-people stuff, in addition to addressing the legacies of the war, the bedrock of our people-to-people relationship has been educational exchange. From the founding of the first Fulbright program with the support of Harvard, now 30 years ago, to the establishment of Fulbright University in Ho Chi Minh City. Today, Vietnamese citizens study in the U.S. at a higher rate than any of their counterparts anywhere else in Southeast Asia. There were approximately almost 100,000 Vietnamese students studying in the U.S. over the last 4-year period that the Department of Ed released stats, contributing about $1 billion to the U.S. economy. And all that, again, builds that trust, that people-to-people trust that regardless of differences in the regimes, regardless of the ups and downs of official relations with the Vietnamese government, have helped underpin all the cooperation, military, economic, political, and social, that have gone underway in the last 30 years. And I think for both sides, it helps bind the wounds of the war. Gallup just released its annual World Opinion Survey. They do these in 130 or 140 countries around the world. And, every year they ask questions. Do you trust the U.S.? How do you feel about the U.S.? Do you trust China? Do you trust Russia? Would you like to guess what the highest approval ratings for the United States anywhere in Southeast Asia are? They're in Vietnam. It's not in the Philippines. It's not in Thailand. It's certainly not in Singapore. Vietnam gives the U.S. a net 47, which means 47% more Vietnamese approve than disapprove. When you count that down, it's more like 85% total of Vietnamese approve of the U.S. That's a lot higher than the U.S. gets here in the U.S. It's a lot higher than we get in Canada. It's like triple what we get in any European ally. It's even higher than the Philippines, which is number 2 in the region. So, again, there is an enormous and, frankly, almost inexplicable degree of warmth and trust among the Vietnamese public toward the United States. That's also shared broadly by the Vietnamese government. I can't psychoanalyze individual Vietnamese leaders. I don't know what Nguyen Phu Trong thinks about the U.S. I don't know what new President To Lam thinks. But in annual elite surveys, which are sent out to Vietnamese government officials, business leaders, civil society leaders, Vietnam again reports the highest level of trust and support for the United States anywhere in the region. The Institute for Southeast Asia Studies, which is based in Singapore, puts out one of these every year. This spring, their 2023 version found that 79% of Vietnamese government and business elites said that in any conflict between the U.S. and China, Vietnam should side with the U.S. 79%, second only to the Philippines. Far higher than we would get anywhere else in the region. And this has been growing quite rapidly. Those Gallup numbers I cited, the sky-high approval for the U.S., those are up a net 78 points in the last 15 years. So basically from the start of the Obama administration through to today, regardless of who has been in office on either side, there's been a straight line in Vietnamese approval for the United States, underpinned by this growing relationship, which helps facilitate everything else we do. Now, a lot of this is due to effort, very proactive effort by officials and diplomats, individual business people, scholars, veterans organizations, etc., on both sides. It also has a lot to do with China. When you ask Vietnamese citizens and elites about external threats, nobody views the U.S. as a threat. The wounds of the war are still very real, but they don't echo into current strategic perceptions of Vietnam. China does. The Vietnamese public is well aware that Vietnam spent the last 2,000 years fighting China off and on. Vietnam's the only country on earth that can claim that it defeated 3 members of the UN Security Council, most recently China, in 1979. The only 2 senior officials in the entire Chinese government with any combat experience got it in Vietnam when they were mauled in northern Vietnam and pushed back. When you look at Vietnamese threat perceptions, China's number 1, everything else is a distant second. And that growing anxiety about Beijing has been a tide that really lifts all boats. It makes things that would have been considered impossible 10 years ago very, very possible in the Vietnamese government. It leads even old party apparatchiks and public security bureau officials to embrace a new relationship with the U.S. because China is the real boogeyman in the region. South China Sea is the leading example of this, but not the only one. Vietnamese forces fought China last in the South China Sea in 1988. They've been boarded, beat up, rammed, and attacked by China on a monthly basis for at least the last 10 years. That has built up a huge degree of support for maritime security cooperation with the U.S. It explains why 2 cycles ago, we had Vietnamese participation in the Rim of the Pacific naval exercise for the first time. We've got U.S. aircraft carriers that pull into Vietnamese ports about once a year now. We've got U.S. Coast Guard personnel based at the embassy working hand in glove with Vietnamese counterparts. This stuff flies under the radar, but it's extremely important. It builds that connective tissue between the 2 militaries and the 2 governments that facilitates everything else. Let me briefly address Cambodia and Laos, and then I'd welcome any questions. Cambodia is quite a different story, obviously. Cambodia was supposed to be the good news story, right? With the conclusion of the Paris Peace Accords now over 30 years ago, Cambodia was supposed to be a success story for the West and the UN overall. The peace-building effort, the creation of a democracy that was supposed to function, bringing together all factions after the end of the war, has fallen apart. Cambodia's democracy has really not existed for almost 10 years now, ever since the Cambodian government decided to disband the CNRP, the opposition, and put tanks into the streets of Phnom Penh in 2015 after they had lost their congressional majority. Cambodia is an autocracy. It's an autocracy that holds elections, but it's an autocracy. And that has led to an obvious chill in the U.S. relationship. You know, one of the things that people have trouble understanding, and Cambodians have trouble understanding, they'll say, well, you know, Vietnam is an autocracy. Sure, but the U.S. tends to view these things in relative terms. It's not where you are, it's where you started and where you're going. And Cambodia has been in absolute free fall. Yes, we have a new government that took power last year with Prime Minister Hun Manet, but Hun Manet is the eldest son of former Prime Minister Hun Sen, and every other member of the cabinet is either the son or daughter of the person who held that position previously. It's the first and only that I know of modern example of an entire generation of new bureaucrats being elevated. It's effectively a feudal system in which if you're not born into a powerful family in Cambodia, you might as well not even try. And that has put a real chill on the relationship. It doesn't help that the Cambodian People's Party, its legitimacy is derived in large part from the patronage it can give out, the corruption that underpins their rule. And where does that patronage come from? It mainly comes from China these days. So Cambodia, for the last 10 years, has fallen ever farther into China's orbit simply because the ruling party doesn't have many other options. That's why now we have effectively a Chinese naval base operating in Cambodia. Now, nobody's willing to say that Ream Naval Base in Cambodia is a Chinese naval base, but as my team at AMTI published just last month, there have been 2 Chinese warships docked at it for 7 months and counting. China built the entire facility. There's housing there holding Chinese personnel who have been there probably for a couple of years now. Why would Cambodia, whose constitution explicitly forbids the presence of foreign troops, given its Syrian experience during both Vietnam and the Vietnamese invasion, allow Chinese forces to permanently garrison one of its military bases? Well, it's because it needs China. It needs China because it has no alternatives. Now, Secretary of Defense Austin was just in Cambodia a little over a week ago, trying to feel out pragmatic cooperation with the new Hun Manet government, and I think that is smart. Hun Manet is not his father. He might come from the same nepotistic network, but he was West Point educated. He spent plenty of time in the U.S. He is perhaps more reasonable. And more importantly for us, we have to view this as a long-term investment. If we look at that same Gallup survey I cited, how do you feel about U.S. versus how do you feel about China? In Cambodia, the Cambodian public reports 43% more relative support for the U.S. than China. It is the 4th best ratings we get anywhere in the region, following Vietnam, Philippines, and Myanmar. Better than Singapore, better than Indonesia, better than Thailand, another U.S. treaty ally. The Cambodian public is deeply, deeply antagonistic toward China and deeply supportive of closer ties with the United States, views the U.S. as that beacon of democracy that, so few places still seem to. And as we enter a new generation of leadership in Cambodia, the old revolutionary generation of Hun Sen and his ilk leave the scene, they're going to have to become more responsive to public opinion. Hun Manet and these other princelings, they do not command the same degree of legitimacy, the same national, reflexive subservience that their fathers could. And so there will be increasing space for Cambodian civil society, for political organizations. The more the U.S. can remain engaged, the more the U.S. will be there when the wheel inevitably turns. And it will turn. It turns everywhere. It just takes longer than we're often comfortable with. With Laos, I don't have a lot to say. I will note, it may surprise you, that Laos also, the Laos citizens report more support for the U.S. than China, but by a much narrower margin. In general, both China and the U.S. are quite popular in Laos. The Laos regime remains relatively closed to deep U.S. engagement, at least the kind of engagement that we've seen with Vietnam and the rest of the region. We have seen the use of UXO remediation as a lever that has opened up some space. When I started in this field now 13, 14 years ago, groups like Legacies of War were fighting to get $1 million in the annual budget for UXO removal in Laos. Now they're multiples above that and continuing to grow. But other than the UXO issue, it's kind of hard to find a success story. We also have to be quite worried about Laos's agency these days. Laos has allowed China to build its first ever high-speed rail across the entire country, cutting the country in two. That really only makes economic sense for China. It's never going to turn a profit. China now controls Laos's entire electricity grid. Electricity to Laos was handed over to a Chinese state-owned enterprise because of debt burden. Just this week, the Laos government reported that they only have 10% of the cash on hand they need to service their interest on debt, most of which is held by China this year. So China has Laos hanging over a cliff. The only thing that keeps the entire Laos government from falling into sovereign default is because China doesn't let it. And that means that there's not a whole lot that Vientiane can do without Chinese approval. But nonetheless, we have seen pragmatic cooperation with Laos succeed. We just have a much more limited scope of what we can do with Vientiane than what we can do in Hanoi or even with Phnom Penh. And I am aware that we're already running behind today, so maybe I'll just conclude there, and I would welcome any questions you have about U.S. policy overall or what we get up to here at the think tanks. Thank you.
Please keep it short. This week we're running bumping up against
I saw it too. Yes, sir.
Well, you described robust exchanges between U.S. and Vietnam. Is that? Can you describe that the cultural and educational exchanges with Laos and Cambodia as well?
So we have certainly seen a boom, not so much in Laos. There's not a large number of Laos students going abroad, Lao businessmen going abroad, et cetera. With Cambodia, certainly. And you have a very similar interaction you do with Vietnam, where you have both visiting students and business people coming in and interacting in sometimes complicated ways with Khmer Americans who live here. The numbers are much smaller, both overall and as a percentage of the population. We haven't had the same history of educational exchange and government-supported educational exchange that we saw with Vietnam. Efforts to roll up debt owed to the U.S. into educational programs was a big part of normalization. And we've also had, well, frankly, a lot more success by China in attracting Cambodian students. So you get more Cambodian students studying in China than studying in the U.S., although most still prefer to go to places like France. Whereas in Vietnam, it's something like 1/8 the number in China. There's just no interest. There's, part of this comes down to cost and ease and visa issues, but a lot of it just comes down to preference. Nobody in Vietnam wants to go get a degree in China. Yes, sir.
What's Vietnam's motivation for cooperating so much with us?
I think two things. So ever since going all the way back to the Doi Moi economic reforms of 1986, the Vietnamese Communist Party's legitimacy rests in large part on delivering prosperity and economic growth. And that has mandated a progressive opening to the world, opening to foreign investment, opening to development assistance, opening to trade. The U.S. is a growing investment partner. Anybody here who's using a Samsung phone right now, it was almost certainly built in Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam is a huge part of the international supply chain system, and that mandates that Vietnamese officials continue to, within reason, I mean, they're not going to, this is not going to be a completely open market anytime soon, but within reason, work with the U.S. and other Western countries to meet the demands of business and so on. The second component is that threat perception of China. The saying in Vietnam is shaped the way it is because of 2,000 years of having China on its back. I would argue that nations are made by the stories that we tell our children. The story you get told in kindergarten in Vietnam is why you don't speak Chinese. And so anybody who's going to be useful in ensuring that Vietnam never falls too deeply into a Chinese orbit is going to be seen as a critical partner. And there is no other pole in the system other than the United States that can give Vietnam that space.
This is a really quick question. Can you confirm or deny whether or not China is building a dam in Laos on the tri-border?
A dam, I'm not sure. China is building the Funan Teco Canal in Cambodia, which will flood much of the tri-border. So the Funan Teco Canal, in addition to potentially having real security concerns for Vietnam, because it could, hypothetically, this would allow ships to sail up from the Gulf of Thailand straight to Phnom Penh without having to go through Vietnam to get upriver. This would bring Saigon, among other parts of South Vietnam, hypothetically into range of Chinese boats. It would also have huge surveillance implications, but the real problem is that it will completely wreck the seasonal flooding that so much agriculture, both around the Tonle Sap in Cambodia and on the Vietnamese side of the border, are dependent on. And so far, the Cambodian government has not been receptive to those concerns.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.
So again, this is on behalf of Mr. McCaig and the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, just our framed recognition folder. We really appreciate you sharing navigating some challenges, and which we all try to turn into opportunities. The information that we get, we have a plans and policy directorate. Some of our desk officers are sitting around the room. Raise your hand so you can see. So they really engage with these folks. We engage at all levels, so we have an understanding of the geopolitical situation that's going on, and it helps us as leaders, as senior leaders, like Ms. Sumter Winbush, myself, and Mr. McCaig, as we travel. It really helps us understand the perspectives, so we're not only sharing our own initiative, but also understanding the U.S. government's larger goals throughout the region. And that really just helps us as we try to advance this mission. So we really appreciate all that you do over there. Appreciate you sharing some time with us today. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Okay, folks, our next talk is going to be Insights on Vietnam-U.S. Relations. I'm pleased to call forward Ambassador Vinh, former Ambassador of Vietnam to the U.S. and President of the Vietnam-U.S. Society. Give him a big round.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm very much honored to be here, and certainly I thank the DPAA for the invitation. This time I travel over here, I remember 10 years ago, I started my job as ambassador of Vietnam to the US, so already 10 years. But during that point in time, I was able to work with the DPAA, with the different light agencies here on the question of war legacy, and also with the legal of the families of persons missing in action. My heart and thoughts continue to be here in this solemn mission between Vietnam and the U.S. I was asked to speak about Vietnam-U.S. relations, and I think our colleague Derek Grossman has been mentioned a lot about it also. So I will speak in the context of not only Vietnam-U.S. relations, but also how it improved and how it facilitates our job here in working together on the world legacy issues. Actually, the Vietnam-U.S. relation has been traveling a long journey. And I want to, if we look back, I want to mark last year. Last year, 2023, was the 10th anniversary of our relationship of comprehensive partnership. And that period of 10 years was the fastest goal in our relationship. And among other things, we have been, number one, enhancing our political exchange and diplomatic engagement. Number two, our economic relations and ties have been strengthened, especially in trade, investment, and in others. The trade figures that has been given by Derek Schwarzman also told us how much we have been doing together. But one thing is that over the last 10 years, Vietnam and U.S. trade, two-way trade, has been growing 40 times from some 30 billion US dollars to more than 120 billion US dollars today. And certainly the people-to-people exchange has been enhanced also. Derek Grossman also mentioned about the number of students studying here in the US. We send more and more students over here, not only by the government, but by the families, according to their personal choice. So the U.S. is a very much favored destination for the families to send students over here. And we rank number one in Southeast Asia to have in the numbers of students that we have here, and number 6 across the world with regard to other rich countries. We also enhance certainly our cooperation on the world legacy issues that I will be touching upon it later on in more details. But last year, 2023, is also much more important because there was a landmark achievement between Vietnam and the U.S. in their relations. President Biden visited Vietnam in September last year, and the two of us have agreed on upgrading our relationship to the highest level, as mentioned, of Vietnam's foreign relations, that is the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Among the things that we talk about when we develop the framework, the new framework of Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, number one, we will strengthen our political engagement and also deepen the principles that guide our relationships, that includes also the respect for each other's political system. And number two, we will continue to deepen our ties in economic and investment and trade areas. But this time, we open new opportunities for cooperation, including in green energy transition, including in technology and innovation based development that includes also semiconductor areas. And we also are working together to ensure and enhance the resilience of the supply chains amid the fluctuations of the world market and supply disruptions. And people-to-people ties continue to be there and very much important to us. But one thing, the world legacy issue was very much a critical point and crucial part of our overall relationship. What I want to try to say is that if we look back not only 10 years, but look back 50 years of our relationship since the end of the war, then we will see step by step we have overcome differences, we have come to understand each other more, but more importantly, deepening understanding, enhancing people-to-people ties, working together by enhancing political exchange. We have deepened our political trust and people-to-people trust. This is very much important for us. Why we, at the same time, why we are enhancing and strengthening our relationship. We are expanding also our area of shared interests, including cooperation of bilateral nature and cooperation regarding the region of Indo-Pacific and also the world. And I think that political trust and confidence between Vietnam and the U.S. will continue to be there and continue to be deeper. Now, talking on the world legacy issue, I must say that this is a crucial part and parcel of our relationship. Throughout the years, we have been achieving enormous progress that has been highlighted by the DPA, not only today, but also in other occasions. And one of the things that we have to think is that both of us think this is a noble mission, a solemn mission of humanitarian nature, Vietnam and the U.S. working effectively together at policy level and also at the operational level. The U.S. has been increasing its assistance to Vietnam, including assistance to the people affected by the war, but also to the environment, including the cleaning of the two projects, big projects on cleaning of the airports in Da Nang and now airports in Bien Hoa. Vietnam continues to consider this one as an important one and continue to work effectively and fully and closely with the U.S. side on the MIA issue. Last year, we commemorated 50 years of what we call the Vietnam Office for Seeking Missing Actions. This is the focal point that we work together with you in fighting the American remains. And it was established in March 1973. This is very much early after the end of the war, and we continue to be working closely with the U.S. through this office as well. And the office is coordinating the line agencies concerning Vietnam, especially the Foreign Ministry, the Public Security Ministry, and the Defense Ministry. And also last year, we commemorated 35 years of our joint activities. The first joint activities was done in 1988. So 35 years we have been working together on joint excavation and search. During that ceremony, we have paid tribute to all people who have been working together to make this solemn mission going further forward, meeting the expectations of the families on both sides, Vietnam and the U.S. But at the same time, we pay tribute to those who have made policies and environment for us to facilitate us in our job today. Now, that the U.S. and Vietnam has upgraded our relationship to the highest level of comprehensive strategic partnership, it's not only expanding our shared goals with regard to bilateral relations, our shared interests to bilateral relations, but also with regard to the region of Indo-Pacific. At the same time, it creates enormous momentum for us to work together on different areas of cooperation, including in this very much important area of world legacy issues. And Vietnam continue to support and to work effectively with the U.S. on this issue, as you said, until the final account of those persons missing in action. We try to do that together with you. For me, I've been working long on the U.S.-Vietnam relations. My first trip abroad as a young diplomat was here in New York, and I joined the delegation to the UN back in 1983. At that point in time, the relationship of our two nations was still difficult. I was posted in New York twice during the 1980s and during the 1990s. And my last posting was here from 2014 to 2018. So not only, though I work in different areas, including multilateral and bilateral, but the U.S. is there that I continue to work. Now, as current president of the Vietnam-U.S. Society, which is an organization that is in charge of people-to-people relations and ties on the part of Vietnam with regard to the U.S. So we will continue to be there, not only on behalf of the government of Vietnam when they continue to work closely with you, but also for me as part of the Vietnam-U.S. Society. We continue to be a partner of you, and certainly we need to work together until the expectation and the goal of our solemn mission is achieved. We are committed to work with you. We are committed to cooperate with you, and we need your assistance as well. So we share the feelings of our loved ones, about our loved ones on both sides, and this is very much part of our mission. Thank you very much, then.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us. As you were speaking, I thought there was a Franciscan monk named Father Richard Rohr who said, pain that is not transformed is transferred. And I believe that the relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam has been transformative since the war. So we really appreciate the support you guys give us in country and present you with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you. Whenever you go to Vietnam, please call me. Thank you.
All right, well, I guess I can just take it from here. Mike, are you good? Because I think I am keeping you between lunch. So I'm just going to tell you, lunch, 1:30, be back for the next brief. So we'll take a pause here. You're welcome to hang out. If you have any questions, I'll hang out here for a few minutes. If anybody who asked questions during the briefs would like to follow up, let me know. But we'll definitely address those in the Q&A later today. Thanks so much.